Hello, welcome back to the Historian Stamtish. I have the pleasure in introducing once again Professor Alan Lester, who is going to give us his 5 minutes on his chosen book.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'm going to talk about this book, The Truth About Empire, which I edited and which contains essays by 15 colleagues, academic historians of the British Empire. So I'll say a little bit about the context in which the book was produced before I get into its arguments and what it says. So in terms of the context, since Black Lives Matter, June 2020, the demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd in the USA and their spread to Britain, we've seen a backlash, not just against linking British slave trading with present racial inequalities in Britain, something which demonstrated in Bristol did very clearly when they targeted the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston in the context of a COVID pandemic that was disproportionately affecting Black people today. So they targeted that very close link between past and present. And we've seen a backlash, not just against that, but much more generally, I think, against critical approaches to British colonial history. Um, as part of the right-wing populist surge that we've seen in recent years across much of Western Europe and the USA, academic historians researching the violence, the racism, the economic exploitation that were key facets of British colonialism, not the totality of British colonialism, as some allege, but key facets of British colonialism have been traduced simply by drawing attention to these aspects of colonialism, working on them. Historians have been condemned as woke, as anti-British, and as destabilizing social cohesion, and so on. So we've seen this sort of wide-ranging attack on critical approaches to history from a nationalist perspective. And as more books and articles in the right-wing press in Britain have attempted to recover older, less critical ways of understanding the empire in recent years. Books like Nigel Biggar's Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning, which has become something of a sort of Bible for imperial apologists, recreate the empire in very similar ways to the ways that many Britons used to think about it over 100 years ago, as broadly well-intentioned, morally justifiable on the whole, bringing more good on balance to those colonised than bad. So in that context, of an attempt to rehabilitate the empire and turn back decades of more critical historiographical inquiry, I gathered together 15 professional historians with, between us, collectively centuries of experience in archival research to write concise overviews of the more nuanced, evidence-based research that we've been doing on some of these key areas of contention about Britain's colonial past. Satnam Sanghera, the Times journalist and popular writer of best-selling books Empire World and Empire Land, some of the first to bring a slightly more critical awareness of British imperial entanglements to many Britons, wrote the foreword to the book on these recent politics of empire and his take on why historians have become targeted as part of this war on woke. I then wrote a substantial introduction to the book, and in that, I want to get away from something implied by the title, The Truth About Empire. This book isn't an attempt to give a didactic, unquestioning, definitive, singular truth about the past. You know, we're professional historians, we know better than that. So in that introduction, I write about what is truth in history, what distinguishes academic historians who are led by curiosity about the past, what distinguishes their attempts to try to access the truth from more politically driven, present-minded, nationalistic polemics. You know, where does that difference lie? But I also talk about the difficulties that even the best intentioned, curiosity-driven researchers have in accessing the truth. The problems with sources, the partiality of sources, the limited perspectives, the unavailability of certain voices, the multiplicity of perspectives, and so on. And I discuss what has been sort of devised over the generations as an ethical code of practice for approaching history that provides guardrails against academic historians becoming too polemical and becoming too tendentious in their research. They don't always work, but I discuss in what way they're supposed to work. Then we get into the chapters themselves. So just to run quickly through some of the authors and topics, Bronwyn Everall talks about what about slavery, one of the key moments, episodes of contention in the culture war. And she focuses on how the deflection from British complicity often leads to an emphasis on African complicity. And she writes about what historians have to say about that. In a poignant chapter contributed by Lyndall Ryan, who passed away between submitting the chapter and the book being published, she writes a kind of summation of her research over decades on the role of violence in the colonisation of Australia. And it's a particularly important chapter because it draws attention back to Australia's history wars of the 90s and 2000s, which in many ways prefigured the culture wars we're going through today. And Lyndall Ryan was a kind of battle scarred participant in those history wars, but emerged through them by focusing on the truth and gathering evidence to dispel myths about the absence of violence in colonisation of Australia. Then Adele Perry, Sean Carlson, and Omiyasu Wapisaw focus on one aspect of denialism about the past that's unfortunately gaining strength again in Canada, and that's the residential school system. We're seeing the denial of residential school neglect and abuse as a kind of major wing of transnational right-wing denialism again now. So they write a chapter on what Canadian historians who've actually investigated this can and can't say about it based on the evidence. Then we can go through quickly some of the other chapters before I run out of time. Um, Andrea Major talks about one of the key arguments made for a British civilizing mission, the suppression of sati, the act of Hindu widows burning themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres in India, and talks about what historians, again, can and can't say based on the evidence about that suppression. Gareth Knappman takes an imperial hero, Raffles of Singapore, and talks about the way in which Raffles was engaged in both anti-slavery and enslavement, and the role of priors and plunder in colonial dispossession. Saul Dubois takes one of Nigel Biggar's heroes, Cecil Rhodes, and interrogates how Rhodes was implicated in the violent colonisation of Southern Africa and to what extent he was racist, explicitly racist. Robert Bickers looks at Britain's relationship with China, including but going well beyond the Opium Wars and focusing on the role of intimidation and violence as part of informal empire much more broadly. And then we come on to some of the more contentious questions about the relationship between historiography and race, with chapters by Richard Hussey focusing on abolitionism, one of the highlights of the kind of right-wing celebratory narrative. What was abolition all about? Liam Lyburd talks about Black intellectuals' thought and the overlaps between fascism and imperialism as they occurred to intellectuals like George Padmore in the interwar years when Mussolini was invading Abyssinia and imperialism and fascism were inextricable. Eric Lindstrom and Stuart Ward both focus in very intriguing ways, I think, on the history of British denialism and disavowal in empire and the use of things like the balance sheet approach fundamentally to justify empire. And then the final substantive chapter is by Margot Finn, who dissects Nigel Biggar's book, Colonialism and Moral Reckoning, examining the techniques that he uses to marginalize certain voices and experiences. So, in conclusion, the culture war over Britain's imperial past isn't going away. And what I hope is that this book, giving glimpses of what expert historians are saying, will help readers to navigate the minefield of the culture war over the imperial past and find a way through it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your book review, and it will be up straight away. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philip.